The next time you fly on a commercial airplane, take a close look at the window next to your seat. Trace your finger along the edge of it. You will notice that the corners are completely round. There are no sharp 90-degree angles anywhere on the fuselage. It doesn't matter if you are flying on a Boeing, an Airbus, or a tiny regional jet. The windows are always curved. That isn't a stylistic choice. That gentle, rounded curve was paid for in blood. Because 70 years ago, the very first passenger jet in human history was built with square windows. It was an absolute engineering marvel, flying twice as fast and twice as high as anything else in the sky. It was supposed to cement the British Empire's dominance over the global aviation industry forever. But at 35,000 feet, in the freezing, highly pressurized atmosphere of the stratosphere, those sharp, square corners became microscopic time bombs. With every single flight, as the cabin expanded and contracted like a breathing lung, they triggered a terrifying phenomenon called metal fatigue. Tiny, invisible cracks began to grow in the aluminum skin of the aircraft. Without any warning, distress calls, or mechanical failures, these brand new planes began to violently rip apart in midair. It was one of the most terrifying, inexplicable mysteries in aviation history. And by the time investigators finally figured out what was causing it, it was too late. This single, fatal engineering mistake didn't just cost over 100 people their lives. It completely destroyed Great Britain's aviation monopoly. It fundamentally changed how human beings engineer aircraft, and it handed the entire global aviation industry to an underdog American company called Boeing. This is the tragic story of the Havilland Comet. To understand the sheer scale of this disaster, we have to go back to the very beginning of the jet age. And the jet age didn't begin in a massive high-tech factory. It began in the mind of a brilliant, stubborn young British Royal Air Force officer named Frank Whittle. In 1928, Whittle realized that traditional propeller planes had a hard physical limit. Because propellers relied on internal combustion engines spinning wooden or metal blades to claw through the air, they could only fly so high, and they could only fly so fast. Above a certain altitude, the air became too thin for the propellers to grab onto. Whittle came up with a radical idea. What if, instead of spinning a blade, you sucked the thin air into a metal tube, violently compressed it, mixed it with fuel, ignited it, and blasted it out the back? The resulting thrust would push the plane forward at unimaginable speeds. He had invented the concept of the turbojet engine. But when Whittle presented his revolutionary blueprints to the British Air Ministry in 1929, they completely laughed him out of the room. They told him the metallurgy required to build such an engine was impossible, and the fuel consumption would be absurd. For years, Whittle's world-changing invention sat in a drawer, completely ignored by his own government. It wasn't until World War II broke out that the British government realized their catastrophic mistake. Nazi Germany had secretly developed their own jet engines, and their terrifying new jet fighters were tearing through the skies over Europe, flying vastly faster than anything the Allies possessed. In a total panic, the British government rushed back to Frank Whittle, threw money at him, and begged him to build his engine. Whittle succeeded, but the war ended before British jets could make a massive impact. However, the jet engine had been proven to work, and as the dust of the Second World War settled, a new, even more lucrative war was about to begin. In 1945, Great Britain was exhausted. The country was heavily in debt and desperate to rebuild its shattered economy. Across the Atlantic, the United States was untouched by bombs and absolutely dominating the commercial aviation market. American companies like Douglas and Lockheed were churning out massive, reliable propeller planes like the DC-6 and the Constellation. America owned the skies, but the British government realized they had a unique advantage. Thanks to Frank Whittle, Britain was years ahead of America in jet engine technology. A secret committee was formed in London with one impossible mandate: build a commercial passenger plane powered by jet engines before the Americans did. If they could pull it off, they could instantly leapfrog Boeing and Douglas and conquer the global aviation market overnight. The project was handed to the de Havilland Aircraft Company, led by the legendary aviation pioneer Geoffrey de Havilland. The race for the sky had officially begun. The engineers at de Havilland were given a blank check, but they were also facing a terrifying engineering nightmare. To fly fast enough to make jet engines efficient, the plane had to fly high, at least 35,000 feet. At that altitude, the air is freezing cold and incredibly thin. If a human being is exposed to the atmosphere at 35,000 feet, they will fall unconscious from hypoxia within seconds and die shortly after. To keep the passengers alive, the engineers had to pump pressurized air into the cabin. They essentially had to build a giant, flying aluminum balloon. But physics is a cruel master. When you pump high-pressure air into a metal tube surrounded by low-pressure air, the metal tube desperately wants to expand and explode outward. The skin of the aircraft is subjected to immense, crushing outward force, and every time the plane takes off and pressurizes, the metal stretches. Every time the plane lands and depressurizes, the metal shrinks. The engineers knew this. They built the skin of the Comet out of advanced aluminum alloys, and they tested it in pressure chambers to ensure it could withstand the strain. They were so confident in their design that they made a fateful, purely aesthetic decision. They wanted their wealthy passengers to have spectacular panoramic views of the Earth from their cruising altitude. So, instead of small, reinforced portholes, the engineers cut massive, perfectly square windows into the fuselage. It looked incredibly modern. It looked luxurious. And when the de Havilland Comet finally rolled out of the hangar and took its first test flight in 1949, it was an absolute masterpiece. The British had done it. They had built the world's first commercial jetliner, and it was about to change the world. On May 2, 1952, the de Havilland Comet entered commercial service for BOAC, inaugurating the first-ever jet-powered passenger flight from London to Johannesburg, South Africa. It is almost impossible for a modern traveler to comprehend how luxurious and revolutionary this experience was. A ticket on the Comet cost the equivalent of thousands of dollars today. The passengers were treated like royalty. As they boarded, they walked on literal red carpets. The cabin was decorated in rich blues and grays, with wide, plush reclining seats. But the real magic happened when the engines spooled up. For decades, flying on a propeller plane was an exhausting, physically punishing ordeal. Propeller engines were deafeningly loud and shook the cabin violently for hours. Because they couldn't fly very high, they had to fly directly through the weather, resulting in constant, nauseating turbulence. But as the Comet climbed to 35,000 feet, the passengers were stunned. The cabin was whisper quiet. The flight was incredibly smooth. There was no vibration. Flight attendants served hot roasted lobster and chilled champagne on fine bone china. You could literally balance a coin on your tray table while flying at 500 miles per hour, high above the clouds and the storms. And most importantly, the Comet was a time machine. It cut global travel times entirely in half. A trip from London to Tokyo that used to take 3 grueling days of layovers on a propeller plane now took just 36 hours on the Comet. A flight from London to Johannesburg was cut from 40 hours down to 20. The world's elite couldn't get enough of it. Royalty, Hollywood movie stars, and billionaires flocked to fly on the Comet. It was a massive, unprecedented triumph for Great Britain. Airlines around the world desperately rushed to order their own fleets of comets, including the massive American Titan, Pan Am. De Havilland had achieved a total global monopoly on the future of travel. The Americans were caught completely off guard, scrambling in their factories, years behind the British technology. But Britain's absolute dominance of the sky was about to end in fire and tragedy. The British dream shattered on the morning of January 10, 1954. BOAC Flight 781, a nearly brand new de Havilland Comet carrying 29 passengers and 6 crew members, took off from Rome, heading for London. Among the passengers were famous journalists, businessmen, and children returning from holiday. The weather was absolutely perfect. As the plane climbed to 26,000 feet over the Mediterranean Sea, the pilot, Captain Alan Gibson, checked in over the radio with another BOAC flight in the area. They were calmly discussing the weather. And then, mid-sentence, Captain Gibson's radio transmission abruptly cut off. Down below, Italian fishermen off the coast of the island of Elba were pulling in their nets. Suddenly, they heard a sound like rolling thunder, even though there were no clouds in the sky. They looked up and saw flaming debris falling like rain into the sea. Without any warning, without a distress call, and without any mechanical failure, the comet had completely disintegrated in midair. The fishermen rushed to the scene, hoping to find survivors. But they only found bodies strapped to seats, luggage, and floating metal. All 35 people on board were killed instantly. The global aviation industry was paralyzed with fear. Was it a bomb? Was it sabotage by a foreign government? Nobody knew. De Havilland immediately grounded the entire Comet fleet. The engineers were baffled. They made some minor structural modifications, adding armor plating to the engines, but because they couldn't find a definitive cause, they assumed it must have been a freak accident or perhaps a terrorist bomb. Nervously, the British government allowed the comets to return to the sky. It was the worst, most arrogant decision they could have possibly made. Just 3 months later, in April 1954, South African Airways Flight 201, another de Havilland Comet, departed Rome at night. And just like the first flight, as it climbed to 35,000 feet over the Mediterranean, it violently exploded. There were no survivors. The British government panicked. They immediately yanked the comet's certificate of airworthiness. The pride of the British Empire was permanently grounded, and a desperate, massive, millions of dollars investigation began. Prime Minister Winston Churchill personally intervened. He ordered the Royal Aircraft Establishment, the RAE, to find the cause of the crashes, no matter the cost in money or manpower. But the investigators faced an impossible problem. How do you investigate a mid-air explosion when the physical evidence is scattered across the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea? The lead investigator, a brilliant engineer named Sir Arnold Hall, realized they couldn't just look at the broken pieces. To understand why the planes were ripping apart, they had to break a plane themselves. And he came up with an absolutely unprecedented idea. Sir Arnold Hall took a brand new, fully intact Comet aircraft straight off the assembly line. He stripped off the wings, built a gigantic water tank around the fuselage, and completely submerged the airplane. They then pumped water into the sealed cabin to simulate the intense pressure of flying at 35,000 feet, over and over again. By filling the tank and the cabin with water instead of air, they could safely simulate the extreme pressurization cycles without the plane actually exploding and destroying the evidence. The pumps ran day and night, compressing months of actual flight time into mere days. After simulating exactly 3,060 flights, the fuselage inside the water tank suddenly ruptured violently. The investigators drained the tank and examined the damage. The massive tear had started at the exact corner of a square passenger window. The mystery was finally solved. Because the window was square, the immense outward stress of the highly pressurized cabin concentrated entirely in the sharp 90-degree corners. With every single flight, as the cabin expanded and contracted, microscopic cracks grew in the metal. It was a ticking time bomb. Eventually, the aluminum skins simply gave way, causing the pressurized cabin to explode outward like a popped balloon, instantly tearing the plane apart in the sky. This devastating discovery changed the science of aviation forever. It forced engineers to adopt a fail-safe design philosophy, ensuring that if one part of an airplane fails, the rest of the structure can hold together. De Havilland desperately rushed to redesign the Comet. They built a new version with thicker skin and completely rounded windows to distribute the pressure evenly. But the damage to their reputation was catastrophic and entirely irreversible. The 4-year delay while the British grounded their fleet and investigated the crashes gave their American rivals the exact window of time they desperately needed. A company in Seattle called Boeing was watching, learning, and building. Taking the tragic lessons learned from the Comet's blood, Boeing launched the legendary 707 in 1958. Every single window was perfectly rounded. Pan Am bought a massive fleet of them immediately. The Boeing 707 conquered the world, cementing American dominance in commercial aviation for the next half-century and leaving the British dream in the dust. The square windows of the de Havilland Comet remain the most tragic, fatal design flaw in engineering history. If you want to see how Pan Am eventually collapsed despite flying those American Boeing jets, click the video on screen now. Subscribe to Altitude Zero for more incredible stories from the history of aviation.